This is Dan Schneider, and in this edition of the Dan Schneider video interview, I am doing a first. It will be a debate, and it will be a debate that is the first of several called Visionary or Fraud on Contemporary Figures in Science. The first one up is the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins. The debaters will be Michael Ruse, a philosopher who will be taking the con position, Ray Dawkins, and Oliver Scott Curry, an anthropologist who will be taking the pro position. And when we get back, we will have more information about the debate, and the debate will begin. All right, the debate will begin in our next segment. In this segment, I just want to introduce the two participants. Oliver Scott Curry is an anthropologist, and I will let him introduce himself and his brief opinion on Richard Dawkins. So, Oliver.
Well, thank you very much, Dan, for this invitation, and it's a pleasure to be talking to you, Michael. My name is Oliver Scott Curry. I'm in the anthropology department at Oxford, where I teach a master's course on evolution and human behaviour. I'm particularly interested in evolution and ethics, the evolution of morality, where we get our sense of right and wrong from and how it works. And for that, Michael's partly to blame, because I read some of his work with E.O. Wilson when I was an undergraduate and wanted to get stuck into that topic, and I've been working on it ever since. So thank you, Michael. I'm here to defend Dawkins for a couple of reasons. One, because his work on evolutionary biology and making sense of how cooperation evolves has been very useful for my research, and also because as a fan of scientific method, I'm pleased that he's out there fighting our corner.
All right. Thank you, Oliver. Michael Ruse, if you want to give an introduction on yourself.
Well, my name is Michael Ruse. Although I teach in America, and I'm an American citizen, fairly obviously I started life in England, but I spent most of my life teaching in Canada at the University of Guelph in Ontario. I'm a philosopher. I was trained as a philosopher. I went to the University of Bristol, did a PhD there. But ever since about 1970, I've been very much interested in the history of science. I guess the influence of Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions was all important for people of my generation. So I think it wouldn't be unfair or immodest of myself to describe myself as much a historian of science as a philosopher of science. I'm particularly interested not just in Darwin as an individual, but in the Darwinian revolution and everything like that. Now, those things led me around about 1980 to get involved in the science religion issue, particularly with the rise of creationism. And in fact, I was a witness for the American Civil Liberties Union in 1981 in Arkansas against a law in that state insisting on the teaching of creationism in schools. And so I've been very much involved since then in the last 30 years in the whole science of religion debate, looking at it both from the point of view as a philosopher and as a historian. Oliver mentioned the whole question of ethics, and I think it's fair to say that I take very seriously the issues of being a Darwinian and what that means for God, what that means for ethics, what that means for epistemology, and all of those sorts of things. So the funny thing is, in a way, Oliver and I are the best of enemies because I think we probably share a great deal, but as Freud says, the narcissism of small differences, I'm sure we'll find plenty to disagree about.
Okay, well, thank you, Mike. Let me just give a brief word on why I started this series and having this debate. I have watched over the years on YouTube and Googled trying to find science debates, and what I found oftentimes, and I had mentioned this in an earlier interview I did with an anthropologist named Nick Longrich when I actually stumbled upon a great debate between him and Jack Horner, was that if you Google science debates online, you usually find one of three kinds of things. You usually find, in regards to Richard Dawkins usually arguing with some evangelist or someone about God or whatnot, which I don't really consider a scientific debate, or you find two of the other people that I'd want to have a debate about, Noam Chomsky debating with someone about some topic, esoteric or political, which again doesn't strike me as a real scientific debate. And then also the third person would be Ray Kurzweil, an inventor who believes in a coming sort of melding of human and artificial intelligence. And I've generally found that all three of those men have tended to, in my opinion, been less concerned with science and more concerned with just sort of promoting themselves. And so I wanted to get people to debate the merits of all three men. And this is the first of those debates. So when we get back, we will get into a more proper format, or the more actual debate, and we'll do that in just a moment. So Oliver, since you're going to be taking the pro position, why don't you go first and lay out your argument in the pro Richard Dawkins camp?
Okay, well, let me start with the science, the biology. So, and I presume a lot of this is Michael's going to agree with. So, I think Richard Dawkins has made a major contribution to biology. He sometimes says he didn't put forward a new theory. He just made people look at things in a different way. But to me, that's what a theory is. A theory is something that lines up the facts in a neat and orderly, rigorous way. It allows you to make sense of and predict new facts. And to iron out things that were previously anomalies. And with his account of the selfish gene, encouraging us to take a gene's eye view of evolution, Richard Dawkins has done exactly that. Previously, things like some forms of altruism, intergenomic conflict, action at a distance outside of organisms, these are all wrinkles, these are all puzzles in evolutionary theory, which I think have been streamlined, flattened out, make much more sense from the way that Dawkins has brought out the underlying logic of evolution and natural selection. So he, in a way, what he seems to have done is, I think of the selfish gene theory as a bit like atoms, a bit like atomic theory. So we're all common sense. We're used to solids and liquids and gases and the world around us. It's weird to think that all these things are made of tiny particles with all their strange properties. And Dawkins has done the same thing in biology. We're used to thinking of plants and animals and fungus doing their thing. And what Richard Dawkins has made clear is that life is much weirder than that. It's actually the product of a billion-year war between microscopic particles. And it's a weird way of thinking about life, but it's no less true as a result of that. And he's done in addition to that contribution to biology, he's made enormous efforts to explain this to people not involved directly in the science, to publicize these kinds of insights and publicize his awe and wonder at the natural world and what it's capable of. So in those ways, he's made a huge contribution. And from that perspective, I think you can understand why he's so motivated to argue with and tackle religion and faith. He's in one of his books, he compared it to a classicist who spent imagine a classicist who spent his life teaching about the Roman Empire, who then has to struggle with people who would deny that Rome ever existed, deny that there was such a thing as Roman or was such a language as Latin. That would be obviously a deeply bizarre and pernicious problem to tackle, and that's what he faces and what other biologists face when it comes to creationism. So in addition to his biological work, he's taken on religion, arguing against religion. And it seems to me broadly speaking, he makes three kinds of criticisms of religion. Primarily, he's criticized religion for being, some of the content of religion for being false, for making claims about the world that just aren't true, or that are not supported by evidence, or that don't make sense. And he's criticized as it were, the religious method, being willing to accept arguments on authority or by tradition or revelation. He's criticized those as all philosophers would, as ways of coming to understand the world. Secondly, he's criticized religion for, as it were, retrospectively monopolizing morality. So putting forward the view that you can only be moral if you believe in God, and without God, there's no reason to be good. So he's criticised the moral claims that religion makes, or the idea that religion and morality are inseparable. And third, he's criticised the political effects of religion. He's argued that religion motivates, inspires, provides cover for unpleasant forms of political action, for terrorism, for group conflict. And when I read criticisms of his of Dawkins' arguments, with the exception of some political criticisms about the proportion of different causes of violence, it seems to me that very few critics of Dawkins actually take issue with what he says. Actually say what he says is false. Okay. So when I read critics of Dawkins, it seems to me that very few take issue with the content of what he says in terms of whether it's true or not. Very few people take issue with those aspects. What they do instead is they essentially criticise his tone. They say, well, Dawkins might be right about all these things, but he's not very nice about it. He's a bit strident. He's a bit aggressive. He's a bit arrogant, as if any of these things have to do with whether his claims are true or not. And so the argument seems to be to move from the sort of intellectual content, whether it's true or false, to an argument about tactics and strategy. And the argument seems to be, look, if you want to dissuade people from being religious, if you want to dissuade people from being creationists or whatever, you should be nice about it. If you're nice, then you'd be more persuasive. You'd make more friends on the other side. You'd have more success than if you're rude, or if you ridicule people, or if you're sarcastic and so on. So I see a few criticisms of the content. It's all about strategy. And when it comes to the strategy, I don't know what the answer is. I think it's an empirical question. What kinds of rhetoric are more persuasive? What kinds of rhetoric change people's minds? And it's an empirical question, and I don't know the answer. How many people has Dawkins persuaded? How many people has he deconverted from religion? Would he have converted more if he'd been nicer about it? Has he just persuaded more people to stop being religious than less strident contemporaries? I don't know, but I would suspect that Dawkins has changed the minds of a lot of people, and he wouldn't necessarily. My bet would be that he wouldn't have changed more minds if he'd been nicer about it. But generally speaking, I think that when it comes to a battle of ideas, or any battle, you need hawks and doves. You need a mixed strategy. You need some people to be really full on, and you need some people to be more diplomatic and more conciliatory. So the fact that so it's no problem for there to be a hawk or some hawks, or for the new atheists to be hawkish. I think that's part of that's probably the best overall strategy. And in fact, I think people like Dawkins, who are more hawkish, if anything, they've created space for the doves to be dovish. So it's a tactical error for the doves to be criticising the hawks.
Okay, Michael, do you want to have your opening statement then? Basically, you can respond to Oliver more directly in our next segment, but if you want to just lay out.
No, I think I should basically say what I want to say first, and then take it from there. Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
So do you want me to
go
ahead?
Go ahead.
Right. Oh, I see. Okay. Well, I think what I want to do is I want to divide my reactions to Richard Dawkins' work into three parts. I'm not sure whether that's because I was brought up on Caesar's Gallic Wars, or because I'm a Marxist, or probably because I'm an ex-Christian. But let's take three parts. I think the first part is evolutionary biology. I think Oliver's spoken to that. And as I said earlier, I think that you're going to find in many respects Oliver and I agree very strongly. And although many of my fellow philosophers would criticize the selfish gene, individual gene selection sort of level discussion, and many of them would go much more for a sort of holistic group selection sort of position, somebody like, let's say, Elliot Sober, I've always been pretty hardline individual selectionist, and I am to this day. I personally, and I think I would agree with Oliver on this. I not only think that Dawkins' science is basically right, but I think I want to say that in the selfish gene, I look upon him as more than just a science journalist. I think that his use of the term and the metaphor selfish gene is in itself a contribution to science, and I mean real science. In my writings, I've always taken the notion of metaphor very seriously. I mentioned Thomas Kuhn earlier. He's somebody who, in fact, identifies paradigms with metaphors, and I'm very much in that school. So I have tremendous admiration for Dawkins in the selfish gene, as I say, not just as a science writer, a science journalist, science popularizer, or whatever, because I think that the notion of the selfish gene, whether or not he was the first person to come up with that metaphor, I think he did something with it in that book, which I think was tremendously important. And some of his analogies about rowing and how the different people in the rowing work, I think is tremendously important. But I think also he's fully aware of the difference between the level of the gene and the level of the individual. He's not just simply saying it's only a level of the gene or something like that. So I defend him there. I'd also defend him against people like, say, Mary Midgley, who went after and said genes can't be selfish. I think Mary Midgley is just missing the point that he's using a metaphor, and metaphors are, if you like, technically false. And but you know, you go from there. I mean, the moon is not a lantern, but I can see a poet talking of the moon as a lantern in a very good and strong metaphorical sense. So at that level, I want to defend him. I think the second level, I suppose, is Dawkins outside of link religion on one side, but Dawkins perhaps at the level of other areas of science, and that would include social science, geological science, earth science, these things. I think sometimes, even if he's right, I think he misses, misses trees for wood or wood for trees. For instance, in the selfish gene, I think the whole notion of the meme is you know, I think it's a non-starter myself. I know that people like Dan Dennett are keen on it, but frankly, I just don't think memetics has been a very significant contribution to science. I mean, I look upon science as something which leads you to unexpected and unanticipated discoveries. I mean, Fresnel in theory of light, for instance. And I just don't see that with memetics. It just seems to me you're just taking what you already know and tarting it up with fancy language. I also think there are some issues in the selfish gene about the transition to humans. The Dawkins rather implies, oh, well, when we get to humans, we can transcend any selfishness or whatever our genes might make us do. And I would want to say as a philosopher, I think that that's, you know, where it starts to get interesting. And I don't think that he really tackles that. I think also, just one more example of something. I recently wrote a book on the Gaia hypothesis, and I want to make it very clear that I'm not a Gaia groupie or something like that. I'm not an anti-Gaia, but I'm certainly not a Gaia groupie. But I thought that in the extended phenotype, here was a case where I think Dawkins' criticisms of Jim Lovelock were right. I mean, if you're going to talk organisms, well, to what extent were they produced by natural selection? And there's no evidence to think that Mother Earth was produced by natural selection. So I think Dawkins is right, but I do feel that at some level he's missing something important that I think Lovelock was trying to say about the nature of the Earth, about why we've had some element of homeostasis, about feedback mechanisms. And of course, I think that although I doubt very few people today would endorse the Gaia hypothesis, in science, endorse the Gaia hypothesis in the way that Lovelock would out of science, because there's hundreds of people who would be Gaia hypotheses, starting with the Prince of Wales, which is probably a good reason why it's wrong. But certainly, I feel that a more empathetic understanding of what Lovelock was about would have shown that even though Lovelock was technically wrong, if you like, that he got some very important points. And I think people working in earth system science today would do revere Lovelock for having, as it were, spotted what was going on, saying that there are some important feedback mechanisms and things of this nature. Okay, so what I'm saying is, although I think that Dawkins is technically right in the extended phenotype, at a certain level, I think he missed something very important that Lovelock was saying. And I think today, as I say, I think that the area which is known as Earth System Science, I think would also say that Jim Lovelock was tremendously important inspiration in doing this and pointed to some very important things, even though as a whole the Gaia hypothesis doesn't work. So that would be the second area where I'd be, as it were, I think more critical of Dawkins. And I think to a certain extent it's kind of symptomatic. And you know, Oliver pointed to this, and you know, we can debate whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And I'm not sure that I want to say it's one or the other, but the point is that Dawkins, you know, takes no prisoners. And when he gets involved in something, he's very passionate. I rather jokingly said of him that, you know, I've not met passion like this outside the books of the Old Testament. But there's no question that he, you know, he does rather see things in black and white terms. And of course, this brings us to the religion aspect. Now, at one level, you know, I'm very empathetic to what Dawkins wants to say. I don't think I've got any more religious links than he has. And certainly, I endorse and admire very much when he goes after, let us say, the Irish Catholic priesthood. I mean, it seems to me not only are these dreadfully immoral human beings, I think that the church itself and the setup has led to this. And of course, even worse today, perhaps not so much under this pope, but certainly under previous popes, the extent to which the hierarchy have covered up and defended themselves and refused to take responsibility. And so I'm very empathetic to what Dawkins is saying there. I'm not sure. I mean, obviously, I would disagree about tactics. I don't know that one's necessarily got to, what shall I say, cuddle up next to evangelicals, God forbid, that you'd have to do it to some of the people in my neck of the woods. But I do feel that a strategy of trying to work with religious people, particularly in America, particularly the American South, I think is going to get you further than just outright hostility. Certainly, I don't know that I'm going to convert evangelicals, but at least I might be able to keep them out of teaching their stuff in biology classes in schools. But I think that the thing which probably really does get to me is, apart from the fact that he called me Neville Chamberlain in the God Delusion, I didn't much like that. I think is probably a turf war more than anything, in a sense that I don't think he takes theological and particularly philosophical arguments as seriously as he should. I mean, as I've said, you know, the first time in my life I felt sorry for the ontological argument, and I do feel that there are arguments about the nature of God and about necessity and things which I think are worth talking about. And I would want to say, ultimately, I think we differ. I think we differ very much on the what should we say, the limits of science. And I am very much on record as saying that I think that science, powerful though it is, cannot speak at a certain level to things like why is there something rather than nothing. I've almost been trying to put consciousness in this category too. So I think that there are subtleties of argument which Dawkins, I think, misses, and I think that they are not just philosophical arguments, but I think they're important strategically because I think it does show how far science can go. And whilst I think it's perfectly open to criticize religion on theological and philosophical grounds, I sometimes think the territorial ambitions of science, as represented by Dawkins, are, let's say, not justified. How's that?
Okay, and then we'll end this segment. In our next segment, Oliver and Michael will get chances to question each other and rebut arguments posited here, and we'll do that in just a moment. All right. In this segment, Oliver Curry, who takes the pro-Dawkins position, will have a chance to question Michael Ruse on his opinions on Richard Dawkins. Once he does, Mike will have a chance to answer, and if Oliver to have a small rebuttal and or follow-up, he can do that as well. So Oliver, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Well, I'm glad we agree on a lot of the scientific import of what Dawkins is doing. So I'm going to focus on the religious stuff, which I think is probably where the more the differences are. So you mentioned before that at the end you said it's okay to criticize religion on philosophical and theological grounds and so on. But just to get a better idea of what you think, what's off limits and what isn't, do you think it's okay to criticize religion on empirical grounds? As what I take to be Dawkins' main criticisms, that a lot of the things that religions claim about the world are not true, whether that's Genesis or Adam and Eve or miracles or whatever. Is it okay to criticize those?
Yeah, okay, of course it is. I mean, there wasn't a universal flood. There wasn't an original first pair. I very personally very much doubt that Jesus rose from the dead on the third day. But of course, the simple fact of the matter is that you're perfectly right that, as I say, many people in my neck of the woods would certainly argue for a universal flood, and I think a lot more than are prepared to admit would argue for a first couple because of the implications for original sin. But I think also, of course, my difficulty is I come from a Quaker background, which is very liberal, and we were never taught that Adam and Eve were literal people. But I think it's fair to say that an awful lot of let's say fairly traditional Christians, and I would say both Catholics and Protestants, would look at you as though you were queer in the head if you said, well, you've got to believe that let's say Oxford was covered by floodwaters at some point. They would say, no, these are metaphorical or allegorical or whatever. Now, I think it's fair to say, I suspect there's a lot more literal thinking than a lot of them let on about, as I think particularly the Adam and Eve issue. I think they're not always as candid on this one as they should be. But it does seem to me that one can make a defense of Christianity, and fairly, I would say orthodox, except of course that has a different meaning, but let's say traditional Christianity, where one is not committed to a lot of these outlandish sorts of claims. So I'm certainly with you there, but
right.
I do think, and I certainly would differ, let's say, particularly from somebody like Lawrence Krauss, but I think also from Dawkins, in saying that I think that there are areas where science doesn't answer them properly. But I would want to say that science doesn't even set out to answer them at some sort of level. And why is there something rather than nothing? But also I've come to think that sentience is something which is beyond the scope of science. I'm not against brain science. I'm not a Philistine on this, or cognitive science, but I think the very fact of sentience at some level is. I'm a new Mysterian, to use the trendy phrase. I think it's beyond, at some level, the scope of science. Now, we're going to talk about...
Let Oliver go. Let Oliver ask his next question.
No, so hopefully we'll
it's not a philosopher talking, Very difficult for us to get the main verb.
All right. Well, hopefully we'll get to the meaning of life towards later on. So, well, it sounds like in that sense, then you, me, and Dawkins are all on the same page when it comes to these outlandish beliefs and that they're mistaken. And I just wanted to say, when we're talking about this, I think it's important to make a distinction between the as I'm sure you would, between the beliefs and the person. You can say a particular belief is stupid without saying the person. That's separate from whether the person is stupid. Someone, they're two different things, and we want to play the ball rather than the man. So anyway, I'm glad that we agree about the evidence for religious claims, and that's fair game. So then what about the second thing that Dawkins takes religion on for, about monopolizing morality? I mean, this is where we came in. I presume you would agree that it's perfectly possible to be moral without religion, without Christianity.
Well, I think it is. I mean, of course, it's an interesting question as to what extent religion does monopolize morality. Certainly, in the Middle Ages, it did. But it seems to me that by the time you get to the 18th century and the Enlightenment, I mean, religion to a certain extent has been fighting a losing battle. I grew up in England in the 1940s, 1950s, and certainly when nice girls said no, they meant it. By the 60s, I'm told, because I'd left England by then, that kind of conversation never came up thanks to the pill. So it doesn't seem to me that in our society, and certainly in our society, I'm prepared to agree in other societies, I'm not sure to the extent that religion does monopolize morality, although I would concede that when it comes to something like the abortion debate, well, you've got the point.
No, look, but you're talking about the sort of the history again. But you're talking about whether and when people have made that claim. And I think it's certainly whatever was happening in the 50s. It's certainly the case now that very many prominent religious people claim that you need to be religious to be good, and that goes from William Lane Craig all the way up to the presidential candidates in the States. So certainly that is a widespread view, and the global surveys of people around the world, it's a common view that you need to be religious to be good. But irrespective of who said it when, do you think it's a mistaken view?
Yes, I think probably I do. By the way, I'm not going to be put down for referring to history. I'm an evolutionist. I think that unless you understand history, you can't understand the present. But I would certainly myself say, I think with somebody like John Stuart Mill, that I don't think that you have to be religious in order to be moral. Don't forget, America is somewhat atypical. I mean, it's certainly in Canada and also in England. I mean, I don't think Ed Miliband has admitted that he's a secular Jew. I mean, he's certainly he's running for prime minister at the moment, but he doesn't feel any need to refer to the God of Israel to promote the position that he's taking. So I'm inclined to think that. No, I'm not inclined to think. I think that one can have morality without religion.
So far, so good. So we're still all on the same page. So then it comes to
yes and no, because I think that to bring the conversation back to Richard Dawkins, and I do want perhaps I'll leave it until I'm going to go after you, but I do wonder to what extent that he's actually made this case as opposed to just taking it and promoting it.
Okay. Fair enough. Hopefully we will come back to that. So then it gets down to the last bit about, well, just to pick up on what you were saying again about the theology. I think Dawkins would be the first to admit that he hasn't read very much theology, and that he wasn't trying to do that. He wasn't trying to write as a work of theology. The God delusion probably wouldn't get many points, but I don't think that's what he was trying to do. He was trying to, or rather, I think he would argue, I'm sort of channeling him, that it's not up to secularists to chase down every last dusty tome that a theologian's ever written. It's up to the theologians to make a case for why these arguments should be taken seriously in the first place. And I'm not sure that they can. I'm not sure that they can make such an argument because even a philosopher such as yourself, who's much more familiar with this stuff, is still not good. You're familiar with the arguments. You want people to do their homework properly, but even you who are familiar with it, you're not persuaded by it either.
No, I mean we've got a paradox here. I'm fully prepared to agree with you that had the God delusion had a lot of sophisticated philosophy and theology, I doubt it would have been the bestseller that it is. I fully agree with you there, and you're right to say that it's an empirical question as to whether or not this was a good thing or a bad thing. That said, I mean, I'm an academic, I'm an intellectual like you, and I do happen to think that we have I go as far as to say a moral responsibility to take seriously arguments. When, for instance, somebody like Mary Midgley went after Dawkins, for using the very metaphor of selfish gene, he responded indignantly, and I think absolutely rightly, look, unless you're prepared to make some effort to understand evolutionary biology, shut up. And I would be inclined to say about the same about science and religion. If you're going to go after accommodationists, as I am, namely people who think that science doesn't say everything, that there's a place for religion, then it's terrific polemics to call me Neville Chamberlain. But intellectually, I would want to say, shut up until and unless you've made some effort to look at the arguments that people are putting forward. I know it makes me sound kind of petty and, just pissed off because, I'm being criticized. Actually, I'm like a politician. I love to see my name. Say anything you like as long as you pronounce it correctly. But I just feel really quite strongly that if we're going to have this kind of debate as intellectuals, as academics, then we've got the moral obligation to take seriously the arguments.
But you've said that the arguments aren't, well, I'm putting words into your mouth, but you've looked at the arguments and you don't find them particularly persuasive. So I mean, I don't see why I don't have to read I don't have to read Lord of the Rings to know there was no Middle Earth. So why should I have to read theology to know that that there's no evidence for?
Right, but we've now discovered that there is the Hobbit after all. So be careful about that analogy. I think that first of all, one needs to find out why these arguments don't hold. But of course, I do differ with Dawkins on. I take it I differ with Dawkins on these matters because I want to say it's not just a good strategy to find common ground, let's say, with liberal Anglicans and Presbyterians in North America if you're going to fight creationism. But I want to say I think that there are intellectual arguments why in fact a middle ground is legitimate. And I'm not convinced that somebody like Dawkins, and it's not just Dawkins, of course, as I say, somebody like Lawrence Krauss is particularly egregious in this respect. But it seems to me that if we're going to fight creationists, then I really feel that we should do our best to find out what the arguments are, what we're fighting against, and why we're fighting against them.
Yeah, I think people have. But when you say the middle ground, I'm curious what the middle ground consists of. I mean, if you have two competing hypotheses for how life came about, or what the world's made of, or whatever, there's no middle ground between two alternative hypotheses. One's right, and one's wrong, and we don't necessarily know, and it takes a long time to figure it out. But you can't. There's no accommodationism between two hypotheses. Why is it any different when it comes to evolution and creation?
Well, I do think there's a difference. I mean, the point is, Oliver, I would be inclined to say that I think that at least there's two legitimate positions one can take theologically. I think that one you could take would be the kind of position that I've got, namely one of deep skepticism, but genuine skepticism. I don't find the Christian story convincing. But at the same time, I think that there are questions which I take to be legitimate questions, like why is there something rather than nothing, nature of consciousness, things of this nature, which I can't answer. And all I can say is,
okay,
but I think another position you could take is to say these are false.
Okay, but you're moving there. We were talking about creationism. And you move to then talking about, whether there's something rather than nothing. That's not what creationists and intelligent design people are putting forward in their curriculums. That's a separate issue. But to move on to that issue, I completely agree that the question of why there's something rather than nothing, nobody knows the answer to that question. Nobody has a clue, and anyone that says they do, I think, is lying. But the fact that so the only honest response to that question is to say, I don't know. I don't see how, and it's certainly possible that we'll never know. I don't see how you can move from that. I mean, not you personally. I don't know see how one can move from that conclusion that here's this deep mystery that we're completely ignorant about, to complete certainty about the existence of a god, of some particular god, of let alone one particular brand of god. The only honest thing to say is I don't know, and leave it at that.
Well, if that's what Mr. Dawkins is pushing, then, you know, I'm not disagreeing. I mean, I know he said 99%, you know, there isn't anything, but maybe there's a 1% chance. I think I want to make it bigger than 1%. So I think we do have real differences there. But as I say, I think that it also leads into issues of tactics, because I think I want to be much more modest about the unknown, if you like. And whilst I certainly disagree with my fellow Christians, I'm not sure that I think that they're stupid for being Christians. I think I could see arguments for being Christians. It's just that, you know, it doesn't convince me. Just like I can think of very good reasons why one would not be a supporter of Wolverhampton Wanderers. But nevertheless, every Saturday, I pray and hope the Wolves have won.
Well, it seems to me that, Michael, when you get a chance to ask Oliver, your questions will probably be more based upon the tactics, because it seems that there's a broad agreement.
No, yes, I want to go back to, well, we talked about ethics at the beginning, Dan. And so when I go back at mine, I think that there's, you know, I'd like this conversation to be constructive as well as, you know, destructive.
Okay.
And so one of the things I want to ask Dan about, Oliver about, is that and the extent to which Dawkins has or has not made a contribution.
Okay, so let me just ask, Oliver, do you have one final question, and then we'll reverse roles in our next segment?
I think we made it all the way through to the meaning of life, so I think we're. I'm happy to move on if you like.
Okay, yeah, so we'll take a pause here, and then when we get back, we'll reverse roles, and Michael Ruse will get a chance to question Oliver Curry, and we'll do that in just a moment. All right, and in this segment, we will reverse roles, and philosopher Michael Ruse will now get a chance to question anthropologist Oliver Scott Curry. So, Michael?
Okay, well, let me ask, I'd like to ask a question about Dawkins and morality and his implications. I should say that I'm motivated to do this by the fact that Dawkins' American equivalent, Stephen Jay Gould, has now been dead for, what, almost 15 years. And we're very much at the stage of trying to evaluate the lasting worth of what Gould did. And I'd like to, as it were, Dawkins isn't dead yet. He's younger than I am, so I hope it's going to be a long time before he is. But I'd like to, as it were, put the conversation to 15 years after his death in a way, and ask, we both agreed that the selfish gene makes an important contribution. But I'm increasingly interested in the extent to which people like Dawkins, and I also want to say people like Wilson and Bill Hamilton, have in fact made a lasting contribution. And this is one thing without being nasty, I'm increasingly starting to wonder about whether Dawkins' legacy, as it were, as a scientist, and I'm prepared to talk about this, is that deep or profound. Now, you've talked about being very interested in the evolution of morality, and I certainly am too. Can I ask you then, do you feel, first of all, that the biological approach to human beings makes a significant contribution to morality? I mean, you call yourself an anthropologist. You certainly know that an awful lot of cultural anthropologists would deny this absolutely. But secondly, so the general one is, does physical anthropology have a future? But secondly, biological anthropology. But secondly, do you feel that Dawkins himself has made a significant contribution? And I'm not asking this in a nasty sense, but
okay, Michael, but before Oliver answers, I just want to clarify. When you said Wilson, you mean Edward O. Wilson?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
Okay, Oliver.
Well, yes, I think he has. I think that he, as I said at the beginning, I think his main contribution has been to clarify the underlying logic of natural selection, and that it consists, or of evolution by natural selection, and that it consists of differential survival of replicators. And I think that when it comes to morality, what that's done is it's made cooperation much less of a puzzle. So genes are, in the metaphor, genes are selfish, but that's a technical term for self-promoting, that's self-replicating. And we know that genes can replicate at the expense of other replicators or in concert with them. They can compete with other replicators in other organisms, or they can cooperate with them. And taking this gene's eye view makes it easy to see the variety of different ways that natural selection can favour cooperative strategies, whether that's promoting kin altruism or mutualism or reciprocity or conflict resolution. The gene's eye view plus the amplified by game theory of cooperation has made it much more straightforward to see how and why organisms are social and cooperative and sometimes altruistic. In a way that previous approaches, whether that's looking at it from the individual view perspective or the group level view, didn't do that, and in some cases obscured how this works. So in terms of clarifying the underlying logic of cooperation, I think he made a big contribution. In terms of morality, I agree with you that he made a bit of a misstep in the selfish gene, in when he said, what's the phrase? He said, whatever it was, but my genes can go to hell. And if we want to be good, if we want to have a good society, then we have to rebel against the tyranny of our selfish replicators and so on. So I think that was a mistake. I don't think that follows from his own theory. And I think he went some way to rectify that in a chapter of Unweaving the Rainbow called The Selfish Cooperators, where he explains it a bit better. But I think being charitable, taking a principle of charity to what he said in The Selfish Gene, I think what he would say is, okay, yeah, well, and of course that book talks about cooperation as well. I think he would say, if we want to be even more cooperative than nature has made us, then we have to intervene with some cultural innovations on top of that. So I think ultimately he comes down to a view that human beings are nice, and because through a mixture of our biological heritage and some plus our ability to our cultural capacities, our ability to invent new ways of doing things, and in that I think he's connected up the study of niceness with biology, and I think that to make that connection has been very useful.
Well, let me be rather unkind and say that the kind of mark I'm now inclined to give the selfish gene is the mark that the teacher gave on the student's paper. Said this paper is both good and original. Regretfully, those parts which are good are not terribly original. Those parts which are original are not terribly good. I mean, couldn't one make the argument? I mean, we've agreed that what Dawkins does in the selfish gene is very powerful. But couldn't one make the argument that ultimately, though, of course, what he's doing is relying on the work of people like Bill Hamilton and John Maynard Smith. And in as much as the book is of worth, the science is there from these earlier men, George Williams perhaps, but that when it comes to discussing something like morality, I mean, obviously he wants to put forward the theory of means, and presumably he feels that mimetics is going to be a valuable tool of understanding, say, with respect to morality. And it just, at least as far as I'm concerned, it simply isn't true. And so, as I say, going back to the analogy with Steve Gould, I think today most of us think that punctuated equilibrium really wasn't that major an advance. And I'm wondering whether one wants to say ultimately the same of Dawkins as a scientist.
Well, look, I don't know how these things are ultimately decided, but it's obviously the case that Dawkins wasn't the only or the first person to take to focus on genes as where the action is when it comes to natural selection. He would be the first to admit that he would say that was the logic of the modern synthesis, that was the logic of population genetics, and that the seeds of what he was talking about were planted by George Williams and Hamilton and Maynard Smith. So I don't think he wouldn't have any problem saying that. But I think his contribution, therefore, but that's the case with, I think that's the case with pretty much all ideas. All ideas have a history, or they're all present in some form before. But what I think his contribution is, nevertheless, is to realize how important that insight was, and to really put it front and center, and to ram it home, to make it impossible to miss. And secondly, to really think through the implications of it. And so that's perhaps more the case in, well, it's definitely the case in selfish gene, but it's perhaps even more so the case in the extended phenotype, where he thinks through the logic of this way of looking at things for how to make sense of individuals, how to make sense of birds' nests, how to make sense of conflict between cells. So yes, the idea was there before, but he really nailed it, and he really took it to new places.
Well, I suppose, we've talked a bit about the extended phenotype, and I'm not quite sure that I would agree with you as fully as you seem to on that. But let's go back to the religion, and this is my second question, and it's the only other one I want to ask. I mean, is, don't you think at some level, though, he's being tremendously uncharitable, in the sense that for all the faults of Christianity, there's no question that Christians have, and still do, make tremendously important contributions to our society in the name of their faith. I mean, I'm thinking, for instance, of Tallahassee. I mean, we've got Tennessee Street, where we've got a lot of winos and drug addicts and everything. And I know it's not people like me who are running the shelters. It's First Presbyterian, and I'm wondering whether, I think of nuns. I mean, I agree with you at one level. I can't think of anything more balmy than spending your life saying the rosary. But at the same time, I can't help feeling that nuns have done an awful lot for a lot of people in need because of the Christianity, and that whilst one has the Catholic priests in Ireland with their hands up little boys' pants, nevertheless, it's like everything in this world, it's mixed, and that one should, I mean, it's like the University of Oxford. There's a huge amount good about it, but if you think of the prejudice and everything else, I could think of good reasons to nuke it immediately, but that's silly, because, that's not how grown-up people deal with institutions or things. Well, so I'm wondering whether the kind of all-out attack that somebody like Dawkins launches against, and Christopher Hitchens was another, against Christianity, isn't, counterproductive. And that's before you get on to Islam. And once again, I don't want to talk about Islamophobia, that's the word. But it does seem to me that a little more understanding of the culture and the religion wouldn't be amiss.
Okay, well, I mean, if the argument is that it's mixed, I mean, it seems quite weak. I mean, and again, I think it's important to distinguish between the people that do good things and the ideas that may or may not motivate them. So, of course, I don't think Dawkins or anyone else should criticize anyone for doing good things, whatever their reason. But I think I'm having to kind of, and again, like I said, it's kind of channel what I think he would say and mixed up.
Yes,
But let me say this. So
let him finish, Michael.
So I think I take a slightly different view on this to Dawkins. So let me put forward this conjecture. I don't think religion is really responsible for anything. I don't think it's responsible for why people. I don't think it primarily motivates people. I don't think it motivates people to do good things or bad things. I think there's more than enough good and bad elements in human nature, and the way we cooperate and compete with each other, and especially how we form groups and how groups come into conflict, to explain why we do good things together, and why we do bad things together. I think the problem with religion is it comes in as a set of excuses, as it comes in as a set of pseudo justifications for either why we're doing good things or we're doing bad things. And in both cases, I think the problem is that it obscures the reasons why people behave in the way they do. And most problematically, when it comes to why people do bad things, it provides it provides an unassailable argument from authority as to why we should do bad things. I mean, if one group says, we're going to invade the next group and kill them all because we want their land and we're a bit hungry, that's one reason. That's a brutal bit of realpolitik. But if that group says, the first group says we're going to invade this other group because it's God's will, or we were meant to do it, or this is God's plan for us, then it provides a supernatural pseudo justification for what they're doing that clouds bad motives in mystical waffle, and I think that's what Dawkins would be opposed to.
I think well, of course, the trouble isn't that we're talking about Dawkins and trying not just to talk about what we think. But I think I want to disagree with you personally very strongly on this. I think that I would want to say that the behavior of many Catholics under the Nazi regime towards Jews was very much a function of their religion. That they read the Gospel of John and other parts, and they really felt that it was legitimate in the name of Christ or in the name of Christianity to be anti-Jew. Conversely,
that's great. But there's been plenty of, if you're talking about history, there's been plenty of Catholics through the history of Christianity who have taken a very different view of Jews, and which they've also cited Scripture for.
Well, I don't see why but you know perfectly well that, of course, Christians take very different positions on things. I mean, the host, for instance, Catholics think it really is the body and blood of Christ. Presbyterians think it's symbolic. So I think there are certainly differences. But my point would be that I think that although you're quite right that Christians have taken very different positions, let's say, on Jews, slavery is the case in point, isn't it? I mean, you had all those people in the North citing the Beatitudes and why slavery was wrong, and you had all the people in the South citing the story of Abraham and Hagar and whatever to say why slavery is legitimate. So one gets both things, but I do feel that simply to focus on just evils is to give a distorted view of religion, which is, as I say at times, not terribly helpful, particularly Islam.
Well, I mean, that's what I said before. I mean, I agree with you that I'm less interested in the sort of the sociology and who the people that call themselves religious, what are they doing? I'm more interested in the content of the ideas. And I think that whether people are doing good things or bad things, it's false to say that they're doing that because of their religion. I think they're doing it. I think nice people do nice things because they're nice, and bad people do bad things because they're bad. And I think in both cases, having a supernatural excuse for it is counterproductive.
Well, Michael, do you have a final question for Oliver in this segment?
I think I was just about to say to you, Dan, I think we've pretty much exhausted this tonight.
Okay.
To be honest, if I can praise us, I think we've dealt with the issues, in a rather thoughtful way.
All right.
And I'm not sure that I want to, as it were, start to drag it on, because I think that Oliver and I, in our back and forth, have raised precisely the sorts of issues that need discussing.
All right.
I would worry about going on too long.
No, that's fine. Let's.
Mark, could you just say a bit about the strategy element of it? Because that's something I genuinely don't know the answer to that. So, what makes you think that being sort of more dovish would be more effective? And don't you think there's room for both strategies? Might it be the case that people like Dawkins, scare those Southern Baptists into the arms of the doves because you think, well, I better deal with the doves rather to avoid the hawks?
Well, of course, obviously, I mean, if one's going to talk about these things, one's going to talk about oneself, or at least I am. And I mean, I grew up as a Quaker in England in the 1940s and 50s, which is a very loving religion, a very caring religion. And so, although it's been over 50 years since I last went to meeting, I find it very difficult just to think of religion in negative terms, because I'm fully aware the person I am is very much because of those loving friends in my childhood. So obviously, at one level, I think that's a personal thing. But I do try, and I have tried to justify where I stand. And as I say, as we talked about metaphor, and I take metaphor very seriously. My own feeling is that all science is metaphorical, and of course, the point about metaphors is they only go so far, and they don't deal with certain areas. I feel that modern science is very mechanistic. It's very, I mean, Dawkins himself in the selfish gene has some wonderful mechanistic metaphors, and I love it. So I'm not against mechanism. I'm not a fuzzy-minded old Holist or Aristotelian like Thomas Nagel or something like that. But my own feeling is that metaphors only go so far, and that means that modern science leaves certain questions unanswered. And I think that for me, brings in a certain modesty then about the scope of science. And I'm prepared to say that I think others, including Christians or Islam or Jews, should be allowed to, as it were, put in their 2 cents worth in the other areas. That, as I've said, I don't think that means that they're beyond philosophical criticism, and I could be all theological criticism. But I do feel that that's the case. Of course, obviously, at the same time, I personally feel that tactically, there's a great deal to be said for, what you people call accommodationism, namely being prepared to work with Christians against creationists and others like that. And, that's what I've admitted to.
I mean, forming allies for political purposes in order to, outvote creationists on the school board, that's different from an intellectual accommodation. That's a different.
I think I want to go both ways. I don't think intellectual accommodation means I have to agree with them. I mean, I could well imagine, if I was, let's say, in England, I could well imagine that when it came to making some decision about immigration or something like that, at least having some liaison with conservatives, not the Margaret Thatcher kind, but what shall I say, the Harold Macmillan kind, where I would feel that that it would be possible, to link across and to work with people at a certain sort of level. And so, accommodationism, it's like the Second World War. Attlee and Churchill worked perfectly well together, even though they both thought each other was, ultimately fundamentally mistaken. And I guess that's basically where I'm at. Now, you're right. I mean, it takes all kinds. And I'm not saying that I want to, not only stop Richard Dawkins, at a certain level, I have terrific admiration. I mean, but I'm not sure that I always think it's as helpful as it might be.
Okay, well, let's end it right here, and let's end this segment. And when we get back, we'll have a little segment where I'll pose 3 or 4 questions to both of you, and then we'll wrap up the interview and have you both give final say. And we'll do that in just a moment. All right, now in this segment, I've basically let Michael and Oliver have at it for most of the debate. I just am going to bring up a few points, and I had some points, but mostly they were covered in earlier segments, so I'm not going to be redundant. The first of my 3 points basically gets back to the tactical argument, and I don't want this to sound ad hominem, but one of the things when I was trying to get this debate underway, I found it very difficult, oddly enough, to get a pro-Dawkins person. And the interesting thing is, when I was looking to do the Noam Chomsky show, most of the Chomsky supporters view him almost godlike. I mean, it's almost a cult of personality thing with Chomsky. And I found it very interesting that almost the exact opposite was true with Dawkins. I had a lot of people, and I'm not going to name them, but who said that they agree 95 to 100% down the line with Dawkins, much the way Michael did, but they didn't want to be associated on camera with supporting him. And some of these were people. Apparently, there have been some personal incidents regarding Dawkins, but other ones where they just found him to be very noxious in terms of how he dealt with religion. And I myself am not religion. My question to put out there is, I have found most people decide issues emotionally. If they're going to vote for a candidate, he looks honest. I mean, the guy could be Richard Nixon, but if he looks honest, people vote for it based upon emotional cues. And I think the thing that I find is, if a lot of the people who are in the Dawkins camp, either scientifically or in regards to atheism, find it difficult to want to associate with him in a public sphere, how the hell do you think that goes over with the people that he's against? It seems to me that you can have the most brilliant orator, the most brilliant debater, but if this is a person that turns off so many people on either side of a spectrum, that's the wrong person to be making the argument. You need to find someone who's, and I'm not that I'm a great Bill Clinton fan, but Bill Clinton, could talk the panties off of grandmothers. You need to find someone who's a bit more, easy to get in there. So I'll put this to Oliver first, and then Michael can add his 2 cents. Do you think that there's something to that, in that Dawkins is just too dismissive, too confrontational, too prone to making quotes that feminists, a lot of feminists loathe him, and other people, that it's almost unrealistic to expect him to be able to convert people to his view?
Well, look, it's like I said, that none of this is about the content of his ideas, whether they're true or false, and that's a very important distinction. But if we're just talking about him, his personality, or there's no question that he rubs people the wrong way, or a lot of people the wrong way. That's to be expected when he's making these kinds of arguments. But he also rubs a lot of people the right way. I mean, he has million or so followers on Twitter. There's a lot of people who like him. He's a polarizing figure. There's just as many people who like him as dislike him. But like I said, in terms of the strategy, what works better, being blunt or being subtle, I don't know the answer. I don't know what is more persuasive to people, but I suspect that a mixed strategy is best. It's good that there's some people who are blunt and straightforward and confrontational, and it's good that there's some people who are conciliatory and diplomatic. I think that's probably a good combination. And if he's taking that wing of the argument, then it's good. And the Dove should recognise that that's a useful contribution.
Michael?
Well, I mean, he is a difficult person in many respects, but I don't take that too, either too personally or too seriously. I mean, I think that let's face up to it, Jesus Christ managed to upset a lot of people on all sides too. So I don't personally take that too seriously at all. I mean, I do take seriously what I think are, in many respects, some seriously, I think, misguided positions that he has, and that I want to disagree with, and I obviously do. I mean, at times it's difficult. I'm quite open about it, not to be either jealous or envious or whatever. But I try very hard not to make these disagreements personal, but to put them on, what I would call a sound philosophical or scientific basis. But no, I mean, at a certain level, given the kind of work I do, somebody like Dawkins is infinitely interesting. I mean, it's very difficult to get too excited, let's say, about George Williams, nice guy that he was. I mean, he was just such a regular bloke, who wants to write about him at great length, whereas Dawkins at least is good copy and keeps people like me in business.
Let me get to my second point then. As I mentioned, one of the genesis for doing this series of debates about Dawkins, Noam Chomsky, and Ray Kurzweil was how almost ubiquitous they are on YouTube. And one of the things that I found, and I don't know if either of you are boxing fans, but when my dad, who was born in 1916, was alive, he always talked about Joe Louis, the famous black fighter who was the heavyweight champion of the world. And one of the criticisms of Louis was that he fought the bum of the month all the time, and that he never fought top tier fighters. And one of you had mentioned a fellow named William Lane Craig, who I've seen on a number of videos. And I don't know if he's ever debated Dawkins directly. He may have. But it seems to me that when I see Dawkins, whether singly or in concert with one of his four horsemen of the atheists, they seem to always debate the absolute dumbest people out there, the William Lane Craigs out there. And I'm again, I'm not a religious person, but I know that there are intelligent religious people. I know that there probably are intelligent people in the sciences who could debate him. To what degree do you think this picking out of the lowest common denominator opponents serves the cause? Because it doesn't seem to me that in any way Dawkins or any of his cohorts on his side could be intellectually challenged. It seems to me just to be done for show. Is that a legitimate criticism, that this is just done as mass entertainment rather than education? Because, as I said, I don't see any other intellectual content, and I don't see how he could be satisfied debating the same points with the same types of people. Oliver, if you want to go first.
Sorry, were you saying William Lane Craig is the bum of the month, or is he the prize fighter you should be arguing with?
No, he's the bum of the month. I mean, I don't. Again, I'm not sure. If he's ever directly. I think he might have not debated him directly, but you see these same types of people.
Who's the? Tell me, give us the names. Who are the prize fighters? Who should he be up against?
I remember there was a panel. I think it was an Australian show, and there was an Indian fellow with an Indian name. I know there was another. Again, there was one set in Houston. There was a televangelist. I remember one show, in fact, where it wasn't even a debate. It was him and Neil deGrasse Tyson, and they were doing this really Abbott and Costello type routine that just seemed totally inappropriate. And so I guess my question is, how much of this is for entertainment value rather than enlightenment value?
Well, so let me say two things. First of all, who you're saying that the Dawkins and the New Atheists shouldn't just be fighting bums of the month; they should be fighting the prize fighters. Well, who are the prize fighters?
Well, I'll give you an example.
Maybe there are none.
Okay.
And the second thing I want to say is that as you were talking before about Googling and looking on YouTube for these debates, I would put a wager on it that at this point, Richard Dawkins has probably debated more people than anyone else in the history of the universe. And most of those debates are on YouTube. So I would be extraordinarily surprised if in some of those debates, in some of those TV panels, in some of those interviews, in some of those exchanges in the academic literature, I reckon he's pretty much taken on everyone there is to take on. So we can make our judgments of the winner based on that.
Yeah, can I speak? I think I can speak to this one a little more directly, if only because I've debated Craig myself. First of all, in defence of Craig, he did a PhD with John Pitt at Birmingham, and then he went on and did another one with Wolfhard Panningberg in Munich. So don't underestimate Craig. Secondly,
I think I'm estimating him quite well, but
no,
I think he's telling me.
Don't forget, Dawkins did debate with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, who, by anybody's standards, is a major intellect. I mean, you may not agree with him, but everybody agrees that, when it comes, for instance, to Russia and Russian thought, he's without compare. So again, I don't think there's any question that Dawkins has only debated wimps or wets or inadequates. The third thing is, I never look upon these debates myself as something I'm going to win or not, because I'm pretty damn sure that any debates I've had with Bill Dembski or Craig, if you took a count afterwards, it would be at least 90% in their favour. And, you know, I know that's going to happen. But I think when one does these, one does it either because one hopes that there's going to be some students in the audience, so the UPR, who are going to go back to their dormitories or whatever, and, you know, going to talk about these things. And of course, as you pointed out, Oliver, in this day and age with YouTube and whatever, you're up on the net, and people are going to look at these things. So, I mean, how much one should spend one's time doing these things, I think, is a matter of debate. And you know, there have been times, not so much now, when I wondered whether I was overdoing it. But I don't look upon these either as a waste of time or a mistake or whatever. I think that there's a role to be played in doing these things. If all you're doing is that, then yeah, it's out of balance. But I don't. I would defend Dawkins on this score really quite strongly, because I do feel that engaging in these things are important. Although, as I say, I don't think you're engaging in them to win over the people in the audience on the spot.
And my final point gets back to sort of the entertainer aspect. I know, I think I read that Dawkins had actively quit scientific research back in the mid to late 90s. And basically, I guess around the turn of the century, I guess the term professional atheist could be applied to him, or a Sam Harris, or the Hitchens who had died recently. But I know Dawkins had founded, he's got an institute, his website is that institute, and I have nothing against anyone trying to make money. But one of the things that I found several times when I went to that website, I found not just ads, which are fine if Google puts ads there, but within the actual blog posts, there were actually blogs about dating services within his ads. And I found this to be very bizarre, and it gets to the inner cynic in me, because when I think about all of these debates that are on YouTube, where someone goes to a university in Australia, or they go to a think tank in New Mexico, or they go to a university here, there, or otherwhere, it seems to me that the main drive behind a lot of this isn't the intellectual edification of the masses, for reasons previously stated by me, and also probably by Michael, but it's just a commercial enterprise. And to what degree do you think that there's any validity to that, that if you're going to be promoting a website with girls in bikinis, and I saw this several times, it to me removes it removes the sense that this is a serious scientific debate, and it adds a carnival-like atmosphere to the whole proceedings. Does that strike you as a fair criticism or not?
Well, you know, evolutionists need love too. So look, I don't know who's in charge of the adverts on Dawkins' website, but no, I don't think it undermines the whole enterprise. If there's if he's running a charity promoting Enlightenment values, science, free speech, then I'm all for it.
Yeah, I'm not too worried about that. I mean, I think there are some. There's a chap in Minnesota whose name I'm very bad to say, I'm blanking out on, who I think runs his webpage, and I think he has ads. I think he makes money out of it. I know people who've written textbooks who make a hell of a lot more money than I will ever make out of it. I'm not sure I look upon them as particularly immoral people, but on the other hand, I know for sure that an awful lot of either new atheists or people who are that way inclined don't. I mean, Jerry Coyne, I'm quite sure, makes not a penny out of his blog. I've got no reason to think that Richard Dawkins, any more than Steve Gould, make money out of these things. I know Steve Gould, for instance, always put his honoraria into supporting his students. He said, it's easier for me to support my students this way than to go out and get grants that somebody like me is probably going to have trouble getting. I'm inclined to think the same way about Dawkins. never ever had the feeling that Dawkins is, what shall I say, a huckster who's, trying to promote this to make money in a, Elmer Gantry sort of way. I just don't think that I mean, I could be wrong, but I just don't see that's what motivates him, or as I say, other people, including Steve Gould.
No, I mean, no one goes into academia for the money,
Yeah.
which is not necessarily what you can say about the people who set up these mega churches.
Okay. Well, let's end this segment, and then we come back in our final segment. We'll give Oliver and Michael their final talking points in regard to Richard Dawkins, and we'll do that in just a moment. All right, I'm back with philosopher Michael Ruse and anthropologist Oliver Scott Curry, and we're going to end this debate giving both men a chance to just sum up and give their final opinions about Richard Dawkins. So, Oliver, if you want to go first.
Okay, thank you, Dan. So we've talked about Dawkins as as a biologist. I think, in addition to that, I view Dawkins as a stout defender of Enlightenment values, of the power of reason, of free speech, and all that goes with it. And he, in his style, he certainly rubs some people the wrong way, but I think he rubs the right people the wrong way, and they're the kind of people that deserve to be rubbed like that. And I think that it's ridiculous for journalists in the mainstream newspaper to take pot shots at him because occasionally he puts his foot in his mouth, or occasionally he says something that can be twisted in a particular way. I think they're missing the much. If he's a little bit rude when he's criticizing ISIS, I think we can let him get away with that, and we're missing the much bigger picture if we pick him up on peccadillos rather than the much bigger problems in the world. So central to that is obviously his defense of science and scientific method. And yes, all science is theory, all science is metaphor, all science is narrative, but some narratives are supported by the evidence and some aren't. And he's not necessarily intolerant of the people who wonder what it's all about and what happens at the edge of science. He's primarily intolerant of the people who don't accept the very well-established theories about whether that's about the age of the Earth or the nature of evolution. And I think that it's right to not tolerate those ideas, to criticize those ideas, to do everything you can to point out those mistakes.
Michael.
Okay. Well, let me go back.
Wait.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I thought there was feedback, so I just paused.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there was. Did you have something? Go ahead. Do you want?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
So,
continue.
And I completely agree with Michael that there's certainly questions that science can't answer. But if science can't answer them, nothing else can. And religious people and everyone else are free to chip in at that point and give their best guesses. But their guesses are no better or worse than anyone else's guesses. So that's the end.
Okay, Michael.
Well, I'd like to go back to my three-part division. And first I want to say that I have great admiration for the selfish gene. And I think I agree with Oliver. I think it was more than just science journalism. I think it really did at some level capture a notion, which I would be prepared to say goes beyond Maynard Smith and Hamilton. I mean, and so I want to give him credit there. Secondly, and continuing with the notion of the science, I must say, when I didn't expect to find myself being particularly empathetic towards Gaia, and I'm certainly not a Gaia hypothesis booster, but by the time I'd finished looking at what Lovelock had been doing and what Dawkins' criticisms, I couldn't help feeling, yes, Dawkins is right in his criticisms, but somehow Jim's got a vision there and makes him a greater scientist. And so I do wonder myself a little bit about the ongoing extent of Dawkins' contributions as a scientist. So, I mean, I'm not a scientist, so at one level, it's not a criticism, it's more a comment. But the third, of course, is with respect to religion. And at one level, yes, again, I think that Dawkins is a very powerful and important voice. I think anybody who's going after the Catholic hierarchy, has got my vote. I mean, really has. Nevertheless, this is a complex world. We've got to live together. We've got to try to fight these things. I'm not sure that Dawkins is a priori right in the positions that he's taken. I think that there are other strategies that I've taken. And although we haven't talked very much about it, we've talked nothing about Islam in the last hour of our discussion. I mean, at a certain level, it's clear that this is, if not the biggest challenge we're facing, a very major challenge that we're facing. And I can't help feeling that I won't say a more sympathetic attitude towards religion or towards Islam is needed, but I think a more academic, let me put it that way, a more academic attitude is needed. And I just don't see Dawkins either doing it himself or urging others to do this. And I think that's a mistake. So, yes, I am critical ultimately of what he does. On the other hand, without Richard Dawkins, my life would have been a lot poorer. So, I really mean that. So, at another level, I'm not damning him with faint praise. I mean, I think he's an important cultural figure, and as such, I respect that.
Well, thank you both to Michael and Oliver. People who have enjoyed this debate regarding the pros or cons of Richard Dawkins should come back next month when the subject will be Ray Kurzweil, and I'll have two other people debating the pros and cons of that man. The next Dan Schneider video interview I will actually be taping tomorrow, and that will be a total change of pace. It'll be on the history and impact of film noir in cinema. So if you're a film fan, you'll tune in for that. So again, Oliver, Scott Curry, and Michael Ruse, thank you for your opinions on Richard Dawkins, and hopefully, whether minds will change or not, people will have learned something and will dig a bit more into the pros and cons of Dawkins and any other people who put things out into the public. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.